Okay, good morning. Thank you for being here with us. This is the panel on issues related to climate change and the Central Valley and Sierras, the area that we call the heartland. I'm Connie Young, and it's my privilege to be the group leader for Fresno. Today, we're fortunate to have with us some experts on several key heartland issues: agriculture, air, forests and wildfires, and water. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists this morning. For agriculture, we have Jeanne Merrill, and she has been the policy director of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, also called CalCAN, since 2009. She has over 20 years of experience in agriculture, environmental and energy policy advocacy at the state and national levels. Jeanne has served as a board member of the Midwest Organic Services Association, also known as MOSA. She's the co-chair of the Coordinating Council of the Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and served for 6 years on the Organizational Council of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. She currently serves on the Agricultural Advisory Group of the Department of Water Resources. Speaking on air, we have Genevieve Gale, who has just been promoted from Policy Associate to the Acting Director of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, also known as CVAC. Genevieve's work focuses on strengthening local and state air policy in the San Joaquin Valley. Prior to working at CVAC, she worked for the Conservation Strategy Group in Sacramento, where she focused on climate, oil and gas, and water policy at the state level. For forests and wildfire, we have Russell Henly, who's the former Assistant Secretary of Forest Resources Management for the California Natural Resources Agency. During his tenure there, he was responsible for California's forest resources strategy, timber management activities, and represented CNRA on the state's forest action team, climate action team, excuse me. He worked with environmental groups, forest landowners, and other stakeholders to facilitate long-term improvements in watersheds, wildlife, as well as overseeing data reporting on ecological performance measures per the timber regulation and forest restoration component of Assembly Bill 1492. And finally, last but not least, sorry. Speaking on water is John Andrew, who is the Assistant Deputy Director of the California Department of Water Resources, where he's overseen the department's climate change activities since 2006. His previous organizational affiliations include the Steege Sanitary District, the CalFed Bay Delta Program, the California Department of Health Services, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the U.S. EPA. So, thank you for being with us today. Some of the impacts of climate change on the Central Valley include above-average temperatures that contribute to wildfires, tree die-offs, increased air pollution, and insufficient chill time for stone fruit. We're also experiencing variability in precipitation, contributing to drought, flooding, too much snow, and too little snow. CCL members in the heartland must deal with challenges including climate skepticism or denial, ignorance of climate science and the impacts of climate change in our region, distrust of government and its ability to solve problems, and powerful individuals or organizations with vested interests in maintaining the status quo. So, now I'd like to ask each of the panelists to tell us whatever you think is most interesting and pertinent from your expert area relative to the Central Valley and climate change going forward. For example, you might tell us what your organization or agency does in relation to climate change. In addition, you are welcome to comment, if you wish, on some of the challenges that Central Valley CCL members face in discussing climate change with stakeholders or communities that tend to omit any mention of climate change. We would be interested in hearing your thoughts on effective ways to talk about climate change in the Central Valley in light of your area of expertise. So we'll begin with Jeanne. So may we have Jeannie's slides about agriculture?
I can, maybe if I can stand up there. Oh, there we go. Does that work? I'm going to stand up here. Okay, great. And do I have, I guess with this I can advance. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
Turn off the timer.
I'm not sure what that is, actually.
I think I know where that timer is.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for having me. My name again is Jeanne Merrill. I am the Policy Director with the California Climate and Agriculture Network. We've been around, this is our 10th anniversary year. We are a coalition of sustainable and organic agriculture organizations. We came together in 2009 for two reasons. One is California, as you well know, had just in 2006 had passed the country's most comprehensive climate change law. By 2008, the state had laid out a scoping plan of all the different ways that all the pathways to achieving the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. But there really was very little conversation about climate change in agriculture, and even less of a conversation about the role of sustainable agriculture in both reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon sequestration in our agricultural soils, and adapting to climate change. So we wanted to change that. We wanted resources for farmers to be able to address climate change, and we were working with farmers who wanted us to talk about climate change, which I realize is a little bit different than other lobby groups working on issues of climate change in agriculture. We are very much sort of farmer-centric and have farmer leaders as part of our efforts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on climate change impacts on agriculture. I think many of you are aware of the issues of climate change in agriculture. But just to say, in 2017, there were a number of researchers and cooperative extension folks at UC who did a literature review about what climate change means for California agriculture. And some of the numbers are startling. So by 2050, for example, 50% of the Central Valley land currently in walnuts and a number of stone fruit, peaches, nectarines, et cetera, will no longer be viable for those crops because of rising temperatures and the loss of winter chill hours, which is the temperature that you need, the cooling temperatures you need to help with dormancy and fruit set. They also found that crop yields for crops like avocados would drop 40% by 2050, 20% for almonds, table grapes, oranges, walnuts. That variable precipitation, greater extremes of drought and flood would be put farmers particularly at risk. And then in addition to heat and more weather extremes hurting agriculture, California continues to lose about 50,000 acres of farmland every year, the vast majority of that to sprawl development. And we know from research done at UC Davis that an acre of irrigated cropland, conventional irrigated cropland, compared to an urban acre, that urban acre emits 70 times more greenhouse gas emissions than that acre of irrigated cropland. So there's a lot to lose if we continue to lose farmland at an alarming rate. We lose out on the carbon sequestration and the other climate benefits of that farmland, in addition to all of the importance around our food security. Oh. I'm not sure what happened there. Oh, can I go back? Huh. Oh, maybe it's just loading. I think you want to point it up at the... Up there? try this. Okay, I'll talk about what those slides were all about. One of the things I think that I understand the group is interested in is understanding how farmers are thinking about climate change. And the slide that you can't quite see now was a study done, a survey of Yolo County farmers done by UC Davis researchers back in 2011. And what they found was that 54% of the farmers surveyed, and this was over 160 farmers who responded to their survey, had concerns about climate change. A relatively small percentage had very little concern for climate change. But how that conversation was playing out, this was, again, a number of years ago, was concerns around the drought and concerns around increased regulations, and then as well as concerns about greater heat waves, further exacerbated droughts, et cetera. And then last year in the fall, we worked with a number of different groups to do focus groups with farmers up and down the state around climate change and their perceptions. We did 12 of these groups. They had groups of anywhere from 5 to 10 farmers and other agricultural professionals in each of those 12 sessions. It included Farm Bureau chapter leaders, resource conservation district staff, of producers of various sizes and different types of crops. And what we heard back was sort of overwhelming concern for the changes in the kind of weather patterns that they're seeing, the impacts to their ability to produce their crops, the changing and when they can anticipate things like fruit bloom, et cetera. And I'll just read a couple of quotes to you. This is from David Cooper, who's a fruit and vegetable farmer in Glen Ellen in Napa. He said, "We planned for a hot summer and then had the coolest we've had in 6 years. We try to change crop plans and plant earlier or later, but it's tough." And then Ted Lowen, a stone fruit grower in the Central Valley, noted the changes in harvest dates as well. He said, "We're seeing unusual weather patterns and the fruit is ripening sooner. Our start date for harvesting has been a week to 2 weeks earlier than the previous years." And then we spoke to Roxanne Sanders, who's a diversified vegetable farmer. She brought up how the greater heat, extreme heat, has led to unusually high levels of scarring and sunburn on her vegetables. She said, "We had 21 days over 100 degrees. We have had a lot of sunburn on our melons and squash. This has negatively affected the quality and volume of the product they could sell." Anyway, and the stories go on in San Diego, where the majority of California's avocados are produced. We heard from producers there that they anticipate not losing avocados by 2050, as the research would suggest, but by losing avocados in the next few years. There's just the greater heat waves are hurting the ability to produce the crops down there. Water constraints, San Diego has expensive water. All the sort of new pest problems are all coming together where producers are having a tough time of responding. I think to speak to Connie's question of how do you talk about climate change with farmers, it depends, and often we will talk about greater weather extremes, the impacts themselves, as opposed to saying the words climate change. But nonetheless, we find the conversations very rich and productive. Farmers are on the front lines. They know something is changing. They may not always agree on how climate change is coming about, but they recognize that how they farmed 10, 20 years ago is not how they're going to farm in the next 10, 20 years, or how their children may farm. So then I want to talk a little bit more about CalCan and what we do. So as I mentioned before, we advocate for resources for farmers to be able to address climate change. Back in 2010, we ran our first bill to say, as the state is generating funds from the cap and trade program, which wasn't up and running in 2010, we said, when you get there, we would like to see a portion of those funds go to assist farmers in reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions, increasing their carbon sinks, and being more resilient. Fast forward, we ran that bill 3, maybe 4 times, and finally in 2014, we saw the establishment of the first climate smart agriculture programs, which are all about providing grants to farmers to change their management practices in ways that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sinks. To date, we've had $450 million invested in those programs out of the $8 billion that the state has invested since 2014. So still a relatively small proportion, but significantly more resources going to farmers than we had seen in years past. Gosh, I'm striking out here. Let's see. That's okay. Let me actually, before I'm going to just go back to the blank slide for a moment. So let me briefly describe what the 4 programs were, which is what that slide was. The programs that we advocated for are the Healthy Soils program, which provides grants for farmers to do things like compost, cover crops, reduce tillage, planting of hedgerows, all the things that you can do to help build your soil organic matter and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase your carbon stocks. That program's been around since 2017. We've had over 100 projects funded so far. There is the Alternative Manure Management Program, that's the other new one, and that is for dairy and livestock producers to reduce methane emissions. Methane, you know, is a very potent greenhouse gas, and that, different than digesters, the Alternative Manure Management Program, or AMP, is all about how do you move away from wet manure handling that creates the environment where methane is released, to dry manure handling, composting, pasture-based systems, to reduce those methane emissions and turn that manure into something that is beneficial to the farm and to other farmers. And then the 2 other programs are the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, which puts easements to permanently protect farmland at risk of sprawl development to try and stem the tide of farmland acres that we're losing in California and reduce vehicle miles traveled. It's part of the sort of infill development. And then the other program is the State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program, which is about farmers finding ways to reduce their water use, save energy, and reduce related greenhouse gas emissions. Overall, those programs have funded over 800 projects and have about $450 million worth of investment. Okay. And I'll just wrap up by saying a few things about, we in the fall put together a set of recommendations for the new governor of California about how to expand and deepen the work to support farmers to be climate smart. And it's about scaling up those investments, integrating the programs, doing a better job of, if we're regulating farmers on their sort of nutrient management, but we're also incentivizing them to do healthy soils, the 2 programs should better speak to each other. And then streamline a lot of that work. Farmers are finding themselves increasingly in California with sort of conflicting regulatory schemes and challenging circumstances, and we need to improve that so that they're more incentivized to engage in positive work. And then level the playing field. California is home to 77,000 farms on 25 million acres, many of whom are small and mid-scale producers, many of whom are farmers of color, women farmers who do not have the same access to resources as large corporate farms, and we need to level the playing field and make sure they have the resources they need to stay on their farms and to farm in ways that are beneficial to them and to the environment. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Genevieve Gale. I'm the acting director of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC. We are a nonprofit based in Fresno, representing the 8 counties of the San Joaquin Valley when it comes to air quality policy. We also do a lot of education and getting residents involved in the regulatory processes that improve regional health. So our goals are clean air and improved public health. So in the Central Valley, our baseline is already pretty dire. We are the most polluted air basin in the nation for fine particle pollution, or PM 2.5, and that's really fine particles in the air that when we breathe in, it not only exacerbates respiratory issues, but the particles are so small they can enter our bloodstream and travel to our heart and our brain and other vital organs. So increased PM 2.5 is directly correlated with increased incidences of asthma attacks, heart attacks, stroke, and premature death. So PM 2.5 is our scariest pollutant that we have. We also have summertime ozone. We rival the Los Angeles air basin when it comes to ozone. And ozone is corrosive to the lungs. So you can think of it as our lungs rusting away in this ozone. And we also have a lot of vulnerable populations in the San Joaquin Valley. We about have 4 million people. It's majority, minority, rather low income, low education. And so we have a lot of vulnerable populations that don't have the capability to adapt to climate change like some of other regions of the state and the country. And how climate change will impact air quality, well, we'll have increased heat, and ozone is formed in sunlight and heat. So as heat rises, so will our ozone, even if emissions aren't rising. And so that has some dire implications for air quality planning. But other things that have to do with heat waves, being in air-conditioned home becomes a public health necessity because those homes with filtration devices in their air conditioning will actually keep particles out of the home. And so as heat goes up, energy use goes up, energy prices may go up, and then those power plants that are being used to cool your home have greater emissions. So it's a bad cycle. Also, with drought and less precipitation, we'll have more stagnation events. We really rely on weather events moving through the valley to get our pollution out. And if during the drought we have less of those events, we're going to build up pollution more and more for longer periods of time. And then we also have forest fires, which we all know are ravaging the state of California. And unfortunately for the San Joaquin Valley, not only are the Sierras often burning, but because we are a bowl, we trap smoke from almost all the fires in the state. So I believe last Christmas there was a fire in the Los Angeles area. The smoke went out to sea, came back through the Bay Area, and deposited itself in the valley. So we get it all, and it's not a great look for us. But there's other experts here that are going to talk about water and ag, and so I won't get into this so much, but climate change is also going to affect the availability of water, the access to water, the quality, and the cost. And so I wanted to use this time today to speak more about my role as an advocate and perhaps some lessons learned that I can share. And so our goal, obviously, is to reduce climate emissions and also increase our ability to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so how do we achieve our goals? Well, as an advocate, we always think, well, what's our strategy? Who's our audience? What are we trying to change? And so to tell a little story about CVAC, CVAC's goal was to improve regional health by improving regional air quality. And so for a long time, we focused at the regional level. And we had the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. And this agency is known to not be very progressive. A lot of the board members that sit on this agency make hundreds of thousands of dollars from the industries that are creating the pollution. And so CVAC had been knocking their head on the side of this agency for a long time and getting nowhere. And so take a step back and do a power analysis and see, well, how can we make change? And so we know that the state, at the state level, much more progressive, much more willing to act, much less captured by some of the valley-based industries. And so instead we went to the state level and we became allies with powerful state regulators, and we had the state come down and force or push the regional air district to do a better job. And so that was our strategy, looking at who had power and who could we be allies with. And that's all air quality. However, if we're going to the state legislature, we also know that the state legislature and the Air Resources Board care a lot about climate. And so we want to understand, as air quality advocates, where are the synergies? And so we're both interested in reducing emissions. I personally am obviously very concerned about climate change. And so what emissions can we reduce that improve public health and help with climate change? And so that's direct PM 2.5, like carbon emissions, anything that comes from burning. That black carbon in the atmosphere is really bad for climate. It's also really bad for your lungs and heart. And so we try to focus on projects and emissions that are synergistic with the climate movement, and we have a lot more traction at the state level. So we have different strategies based on what agency or level of government we're speaking with. And I think the Healthy Soils program is a great example. It's really great it's a climate smart solution. It helps farmers, but also when farmers take their woody waste, their prunings or their orchard removal, and they grind that up and put it back in the soil, carbon sequestration, what they're not doing is burning it openly in the field, causing direct PM 2.5 and building up pollution in our valley. And so working together, we can solve a lot of problems if we have, smart solutions. And now even at the local level for Fresno, it's been relatively conservative city council. However, starting this year, we have majority Democrats on the board, majority Latinos, Latinas, and so perhaps focusing at the local level now is a good strategy. So at the local level, I won't go into each one here. Let's see how much time I have. But here's a picture of kind of northwest Fresno. And so just let's take green space or tree cover as an example. Trees eat CO2, good climate strategy. They also, when you increase tree cover, you have less energy use, so you're using less power, less emissions from those power plants, and you're also cooling the land. So you are reducing that urban heat island effect and therefore reducing ozone. So again, climate and air, a lot of synergies. And if you look here, oftentimes you'll find that the environmental amenities, such as trees, are going to be located in more higher income areas. And the power plants and the things you don't want are going to be usually located in lower income communities of color. And so another synergy is the environmental justice movement, who cares a lot about people who have to live with these heightened emissions and don't have the trees or the solar panels. They're going to be fighting at all different levels for environmental justice. And so again, that's another synergy between climate advocates and environmental justice advocates to work together, perhaps at the local level or the state level, to come up with climate smart solutions. At the regional level, Connie wanted me to talk a bit about how do we talk about climate change with some of the leaders and regulatory agencies that don't like to talk about climate change. First is maybe we don't have to use the word climate change. We can talk about the impacts of climate that are well known and move from there, or we can focus on understanding who our audience is and what they care about. So our region cares a lot about jobs, a lot about access to water, and they kind of care about air quality. So those are all different avenues that we can have these climate conversations housed under. Another thing is this is a map of the Cal EnviroScreen tool developed by OEHA, the Cal EPA. And they mapped out cumulative burdens of pollution and vulnerabilities to pollution. And that map shows that the Central Valley is just lots of pollution, lots of vulnerabilities to pollution. And so the money that comes from the cap and trade program, they say at least 25% of it has to go to these disadvantaged communities, the yellow to red communities. And so a lot of money can be directed to the valley. What do local leaders care about? Access to money. So we can talk about bringing in some of these investments to the valley without having to talk so much about climate, but still getting the same results. And so that is a really good opportunity to talk with our local electeds and our regional agencies. At the state level, you're in luck. State level, we care about climate. Just talk about it all you want. You'll go far. Air quality advocates, we have to come up with a way to make it sound like climate. So you're doing good. But again, forest fires, I think, are going to be a hot topic this summer. Maybe some legislation working in that realm, as well as water and housing. We have a new governor who recently came to the Central Valley to talk about access to clean and safe and affordable drinking water. And so again, that's another avenue. So moving forward, know where your partners are. In Fresno, you have a lot of partners with the environmental justice community. At the state level, the big enviros are your friends as well. Also, adapt your strategy. I know a group that, a really effective group that every year they do a new power mapping analysis of all of the agencies and the people they work with to see if anything's changed. Usually embedded power structures don't change quickly. But for instance, with Fresno, if there's a turnover in elected officials, then maybe there's new opportunities. So take a step back every now and again. And also speak to the needs of the community or speak to the interests of your local electeds. What do they care about? Do some research on them and then craft your argument backwards. And again, follow the money. If there's money available, work to help people get it. No one will be not your friend for that. And lastly, leverage existing plans and processes. There's a lot of things going on already. Connie's been really great at diving in with the air quality planning that's happening in the valley and weaving in climate. There's also local plans, regional plans. There's a short-lived climate pollutant plan. Find out what's going on and find a way to leverage the existing processes to get what you need. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Russ Henly. As Connie mentioned in the introductions, I'm formerly with the California Natural Resources Agency, and that's just formerly as of Friday, so very, very freshly out the door. And I maybe had this kind of idyllic image as retiring as sort of this slow, gradual process, kind of gliding out the door, but I have just been sprinting to the end over the past couple of months and beyond sprinting the past 2 weeks. So I didn't get a whole lot of time to tailor this talk to this specific audience, but I will try to bring in a few little Central Valley threads as I am able throughout it. And before, I was at the Natural Resources Agency for about 5 years, and before that I worked at CAL FIRE for about 22 years. So this is really a remarkable time for our forests here in California. I think there's already been some discussion of the wildland fires that we've seen. And just year to year, the past couple of years, we've set new records for the largest fire, the most damaging fire in terms of structure loss, and the deadliest fires in terms of lives lost. And you know, we went from the shock of the fires we had at the end of in fall 2017 to what I felt was the grim shock of the Camp Fire up in the Paradise area, where there was so much loss and destruction. And And we really felt this in terms of the smoke in the Central Valley in Sacramento, and I know the smoke made its way into the Bay Area as well, where many of you are from. You know, the technical term N95 mask became a part of the vernacular vocabulary in Sacramento. And I'm a bicycle commuter, and there was one day in the morning I left my mask in my bike locker, and coming out in the afternoon, you know, walking the 30 yards from the front door of the building to the bike locker, it was horrible. It's like, I can't wait to get my mask on. So that's a very clear sign of the air quality impacts that these fires have had on us. And we've, of course, there was also as a result of the drought, we had the massive tree mortality in the Sierra Nevada and other parts of the state, with well over 100 million trees dying because of the drought in insects and disease. So at the same time as we've had all these things happening, we've also really achieved a remarkable level of synchrony in forest policy in California. You know, I remember my earlier years in forest policy in California, there was just a lot of diametric opposition, people fighting, redwood summer, protests, et cetera. But now, with climate change and what it's doing to our forests, in terms of mortality, in terms of leading to shifts of species, in terms of challenges in reforestation, areas converting from forests to shrublands or shrublands to grasslands, et cetera. Just amazing synchrony in forest policy, just a kind of a long list of high quality policy reports that came over the past couple of years from the Public Policy Institute of California, the Little Hoover Commission, Legislative Analyst's Office, the California Forest Carbon Plan, which I did a lot of work on, that came out in May last year, along with a related executive order for its implementation, legislative action last session, and Governor Newsom is really stepping into this immediately as well. He held a news conference on this his first week in office at a CAL FIRE station up in Colfax. So, and a lot of agreement of this and recognition we really need to do stuff. And so, you know, the common themes in these reports is recognizing that there's a wide range of values, lives, property, natural resources that are increasing risk to our current forest conditions in wildfire, that we need to treat our forests to improve their health and resiliency at a greatly increased pace and scale. Prescribed fire is a critical piece of trying to do this. Here's where you get one of your air quality trade-off pieces. What's better, the more controlled air quality impacts of a prescribed fire versus the much greater uncontrolled impacts of an uncontrolled wildland fire. One of the challenges that comes from this work as we try to treat these forests more is what do we do with all these woody materials that we're trying to get out of there so they don't burn up? And we prefer not to pile and burn it in place. Where are there opportunities to move it to biomass plants and utilize it to produce energy, which can be a good thing. But the bad part about that is some of these biomass energy plants are located in communities in the valley floor, and they're older plants that don't have the best of air quality control mechanisms. So, Genevieve and some of her colleagues came and met with us while we were developing the plan and really brought that point to home, that that's a real issue and we really need to be paying attention to. And then finally, one of the common elements, this problem is so big and pervasive, we really need a collaborative approach to do this. It can't just be one agency striking out and doing things, but it has to be all the relevant agencies, all the land managers, all the communities, all the NGOs coming together to do this work. And then, you know, my talk is mostly going to be vegetation focused, but there's really a newly reinforced bottom line from these fires that we've had, in that for our communities and wildlands, it's not just about the vegetation. We really need a very broad all of the above strategy, and I'll wrap up with some of the details of that at the end. So just quickly, the overview of the Forest Carbon Plan. You heard a little bit mentioned earlier about the 2014 scoping plan. It called for the Forest Carbon Plan to be developed. We had a large multi-agency team, state, federal, a little bit of local representation on that, public workshops, drafts reviewed, et cetera, and really focusing our work on what actions we need to achieve healthy, resilient forests, and protect and enhance forest carbon and other resource benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, it was released in May. Some of the key parts of the content of it is our science snapshot. We thought it was really important to have a good, strong science piece in there. We all know there's so much scientific debate over climate change, some of it real, a lot of it fake, but we want to make sure we had a strong scientific basis for our findings and recommendations there. Things about temperature change, precipitation, the kind of range shifts that we're going to see in our forest vegetation, fire risks, the much longer fire season we have now, at least some 70 days longer than it has been historically. Laying out clear goals, discussing how to achieve implementation, and ensuring that we have good quality forest carbon accounting so we know how much we're storing, how much we're adding to storage, how much we're losing through fires and other mechanisms of loss. And so just to summarize the goal, as I mentioned, we want to significantly increase the pace and scale of forest restoration, enhancement, field treatments, increasing activity on the non-federal lands to 500,000 acres a year, as well as to a similar level on the federal lands, the national forests and BLM lands in the state. Prevent conversion of forest lands to other uses, which are often more carbon release and emission intensive uses, restore forest wetlands that can be a valuable carbon sink, innovate wood solutions for wood products and biomass use. Lumber, long-lasting wood products are a great place to store carbon for the long term. Again, work collaboratively. And ours is work is a companion piece to the Natural and Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan that addresses agricultural, shrublands, and wetlands. And along with the Forest Carbon Plan, Governor Brown issued an executive order saying, go forth and put this Forest Carbon Plan into place. Echoed the goals of treatments up to 500,000 acres per year, recognizing that there are regulatory barriers to a prescribed fire and other forest management activities. Air quality permitting obviously is an issue that has to be addressed with prescribed fire. And it supports wood product innovation. Again, how can we use this wood in a way that stores the carbon in long-lasting wood products? And fortunately, some of the other speakers mentioned the importance of money, and the money is coming forward for this. The governor put in a new budget proposal when he released the Forest Carbon Plan. Governor Brown, of course, we're talking about here, to provide some new prescribed fire crews at CAL FIRE, funding for landscape level restoration projects throughout the state. A lot of the money that's coming forward is from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or the California Climate Investments Activity, as they're calling it. And the budget this year has $160 million of greenhouse gas money for CAL FIRE to do forest health and fuels reduction work. And SB 901 that passed in the fall set up an additional $200 million a year for the next 5 years. So we have some very substantial funding online to get out there and do that work. I'm just going to start moving a little bit more quickly since I'm running out of time. The governor Brown established a forest task force to move forward on work to deal with forest carbon plan implementation, try to identify and address barriers to implementation and achievement of these goals. And it's still kind of waiting for new direction from Governor Newsom in terms of if he wants to modify direction or not, but they're keeping active nonetheless. A lot of legislative outputs in 2018 related to forest fire, public safety, et cetera, and which was really a good thing, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing more legislation in the current session. And so finally, the bottom line here beyond vegetation, we need to address power lines in terms of vegetation clearing, hardening the systems. A lot of these lines out there are uninsulated lines, so a branch hits them, immediately you're getting sparks that can start fires. So there's a need to look at insulating the lines for new technology that will immediately shut off a power line if it breaks or there's a short circuit. Power shutoffs, you probably heard about the power shutoffs that PG&E and others have been doing during high wind, high fire risk events. We need to harden the structures that are out there. Those horrible pictures from the campfire up in Paradise, where you could see it was clear the houses that were the fuel because the houses were gone and the trees were still standing. So we need to do a better job with our structures. That brings in building codes, that brings in land use planning, where homes are built or not built. Ingress and egress, we need to be able to move a lot of people out fast. We need to be able to move a lot of emergency equipment and first responders in fast, and a lot of these communities don't have that. And so we need to be working more for that. People need to practice evacuation, and we need to be managing our ignition sources. Again, power lines, a lot of fires start along road right-of-ways, and there's really a lot of interest now at Caltrans taking a closer look at how all their road right-of-ways can be managed more to address fire issues. And I think, I'm not sure yet how we're going to do all that. There's a lot of balancing that's needed among these various pieces. We have great variability across the state in the conditions that exist, so it's going to be very challenging to find the right responses in the right area. It can be challenged in structuring the leadership, the policy making to achieve this, and to structure all the incentives and regulations that are needed for everybody in order to improve the situation in terms of our wildland fire risk. And one of the players in this, which is a critical driver, is the insurance industry. You may have heard they're pulling out from insuring homes in some of these higher fire risk areas and creating big challenges for many homeowners to find insurance. So with that, I will wrap up, and thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Russ. Good morning. I'm John Andrew, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of the California Department of Water Resources. And it's a real pleasure to be back in front of CCL. I'm a big believer in what you're doing. Also happy to be, I guess, the last of the four horsemen of the apocalypse this morning. Anyway, while they're bringing up my slides, I'll just tell you a little bit about my organization. We are the state's water planning and management organization. If you probably know us for anything, as full disclosure, in the last couple of years, it's for failed spillways at Oroville. Yes, those were ours. And the Twin Tunnels program under the Delta. So that's ours as well. But we also do quite a bit more for the state. And I actually had a slide. There we go. Perfect timing. That slide right there, and I won't go through all of it in the interest of time, but we do quite a bit else that doesn't get into the press on a daily basis or on a regular basis, like the spillways or the tunnels. We do operate the State Water Project, which actually serves, there's 27 million people, 2/3 of the state depend upon us for some amount of their water, day in and day out, a very routine matter. We also have a very large, because of voter generosity in the state, we have a very large grant program for local and regional water management, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more in just a bit. But enough about us at DWR, let's talk about the Central Valley, and I thought I'd start with one of my favorite Central Valley authors. She's actually a native of Sacramento, and those of you that are from California, I think we all are, this quote could refer to just about anything or everything in California, but when she made this quote, she was actually speaking about water management in California, believe it or not. And what some of the urban folklore of water in California is that we're running out of water, that at some point we're just going to go completely dry, and that's, let me put that to rest, that's not going to happen, even in a changing climate. Even in a changing climate, we're going to have a lot of water, and on this map here, this is the standard precipitation map of the state. The areas that are in blue, purple are the areas that have the water. That's mostly in the northwest part of the state along the Sierra Nevadas. And the areas that tend toward the yellow, red, the oranges are where there isn't so much water. And again, it should be fairly obvious that those areas that tend towards the yellow, oranges, and reds are also where all the water demand is. So our supply and demand patterns are completely upside down. So the Bay Area, the Central Valley, Southern California, all the way out to Imperial and Coachella Valleys, these are the areas that have a lot of water demand, primarily for agriculture, but increasingly for urban areas, and the water is elsewhere. What this leads us to is we have these big interbasin transfer facilities like the facilities that we run at the State Water Project, but also a lot of local water agencies have facilities that move water great distances across the state. Even an area where we are right now, very lush and green Atherton, the water that serves this part of the peninsula actually comes from the other side of the state through the Hatch Hetchy project. So these projects are very important to the state as well as local solutions. So let's talk now about climate change, and I'm going to just quickly, I think the other My fellow horsemen and horsewomen of the apocalypse made these connections earlier quite well, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but everything is connected, water and ag and forestry and air quality. Let me talk a bit about one graph that I probably like. This is probably my favorite graph of climate change in California. And let me just take a moment to do this. I know this is a lot of dots to throw at you on a Sunday morning, but it's not that scary. Essentially what you have on the y-axis is the annual precipitation in inches, and then along the x-axis is the annual average temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. And for every year from 1895 to 2015, we have those two pieces of data. And so this is just what happened during that 120-year period. And one thing, usually in the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward to the punchline here. The blue diamonds there, or purple, whatever color they are, is basically everything in the 20th century, and then all of the black squares is everything in the 21st century. And so the punchline here is that if you look at precipitation, and you go back to what I said, we're running out of water, we really aren't. We aren't, because if you look at all the precipitation, it stays clustered in the middle there. Sure, we have a lot of variability in California, but we really aren't seeing any signal in terms of more or less precipitation over time. But the one thing you do notice is the temperature. And if you specifically notice, there's a yellow diamond right in the middle. That's the average of everything on that graph. And every one of those black squares, which is the 21st century, everything is at that diamond or to the right. So everything is getting hotter. And I think in terms of communication, this is a very powerful graph. I know that we don't have 2016 and 2017 and 2018 up here, but if we did, they would be all out there on the margin. In fact, you can imagine that if we did not have these most recent years, the graph could be cut off. We actually had to extend the graph to include these later years in terms of the high temperatures we're seeing. And people in the Central Valley, they realize this. The other thing that's very powerful about this is you didn't hear me say anything about greenhouse gas emissions. You didn't hear me say anything about computer models. So there's no uncertainty here. There's no debate over, oh, I'm not sure that computer model actually represents the climate. This is simply the data. And I think data is a good, powerful way to argue about climate change. Another one that I think is very real, and this is focusing on the San Joaquin Valley, is the state of our groundwater aquifers. And especially after the last drought, we have seen a real depletion of this natural resource. And in fact, as you can tell there from the table of all of the wells that went dry during the drought, nearly 3,000 of them, 75%, were in the San Joaquin Valley. Again, no greenhouse gas emissions here, no computer models. This is simply, you have a pump in a well and there's no water. And this is something, again, I think that if you want to talk about climate change or climate change impacts in the Central Valley, this is probably a good data point, a good example to use. The last one I have is exactly the same one Genevieve had, and I'm really happy to see that. You see basically the same. This is kind of an ironic thing. There's the graph of bad wells going dry, and then here's the graph of vulnerable communities. And a higher score on this graph does not get you into graduate school more easily. This is actually a bad thing to have a high score on Cal and virus screen, and Genevieve may know better than I do, but I think something like a third of the vulnerable communities in the entire state are in the San Joaquin Valley. So I think this is a two-edged thing. So I completely agree with Genevieve that this is then another place where you have common ground with people, with environmental justice organizations and others that are looking at vulnerable communities and their plight. But then you also have, I think, the challenge that a lot of people in the Central Valley are just struggling to get by. And so if you're going to talk to them about climate change, something that is still seemed to be something out in the future, as sort of a scientific elite type of thing, that's just them being frank about how this is seen by lay people. You need to be conscious that a lot of people are just trying to make the ends meet. They're just trying to get the kids to school, keep a job, and get food on the table. So one of the things that we think moving forward is positive for water management in California is what we call integrated regional water management. And this, again, this is one of the things we do that doesn't get into the papers, is that, again, through voter generosity, through state propositions, we have literally a couple of $1 billion have gone through our organization out to local and regional stakeholders. We really believe that local and regional entities, and there's some 50 of these across the state now, They know their water resources best, they know themselves, their neighbors best, they know their values, they know what capacity they have to deal with water management issues, and water management issues are fundamentally different in different parts of California. You'll notice I have not said anything about sea level rise, except for right now. That's because that's just not something you need to talk to people in the Central Valley about. But you could talk to them about the snowpack. You can talk to them about failing wells and groundwater that's being depleted. So things that are of concern in the Central Valley are not necessarily going to be the same things that are of concern in LA or in the Bay Area or elsewhere in California. So let me close, Connie, and the instructions for the panel were to talk a bit more about communication. It's always a difficult topic, whether you're politicians discussing global warming or you're in a family. I certainly have family members. I have actually a brother who does not, who thinks that I'm pretty crazy to be working on this subject and has said other things that are, I won't share about it. I was born and raised in the South Valley, and so I know this area very well. And just some of the things that I've seen in my travels, both regionally and just in this issue in general, is that we've really it's been a disaster in terms of our communication about climate change. There's been far more doom and gloom than we need, and that just simply doesn't sell very well. We definitely need to give people hope. I think that's one of the themes of CCL, one of the reasons I like this organization so much. I think also, as you saw from my drought slide, I think facts speak well. I think stay away from necessarily these projections, especially projections that go way out and just sort of don't offer people, all it offers them is sort of despair when you see some of the projections for the end of the century. I think there's enough about climate change that we're living through right now, and that's a very good communication tool. Last couple of things I'll say is that I think keeping things personal, sharing anecdotes, going to where people are. Another favorite quote of mine from Joan Didion, and I won't get this right because I didn't include it, but it went something like, winter in the Central Valley is not so much a season, but an affliction. And I have to say that growing up in the Central Valley, that's not really the case anymore. I don't know how many, I mean, it was 60 some odd degrees in Sacramento yesterday. There has not been a single day below freezing. And we're halfway or more through winter. Russ and I, on the way down, were talking about the Thule fog that in my day, when I was growing up in elementary school, I would get fog days off from school, and I'd very much look forward to that. I don't think that happens very much anymore. Most recently, my daughter got a smoke day off from school in Sacramento because of the campfire. So these are things that the lack of freezing temperatures, the lack of fog, the change in the immediate weather, if you will, these are things that you don't have to get into, again, the greenhouse gas emissions, into computer modeling. It's what people feel personally. The last thing I'll note, I haven't got my one yet, right? I did. Okay, well, the East Sherman judge is unhappy with me, so I need to get moving here. But the last thing I'll note is from growing up in the Central Valley, one thing that strikes me from growing up is there were a lot of liquor stores and a lot of churches. I'm going to not talk about liquor stores, but I think there's a lot we could talk about with churches and communities of faith. I've, on 3 or 4 occasions, been asked to talk to social justice organizations in the Valley from the Catholic Church. They do some very good work on this, and I think this is an area where there may be some common ground, again, with CCL, with people in the Central Valley, is through communities of faith. Thank you very much.
So thank you all very much. That was very interesting. So we have just a few minutes for some questions. If anybody would like to have some questions, there are 2 microphones here. We'll just go back and forth. Oh, we don't have microphones. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I'm Don Gady from Fresno, and in speaking to our local community leaders, we'd like to speak intelligently so that we can help pass this bill. I don't know how familiar you all are with the carbon fee and dividend bill that's just recently introduced to Congress, and our last speaker did talk about communication, and maybe some of the other ones have some tips for us. How do we communicate to our local leaders about the importance of passing something like this? If you are in favor of it, if you're not, what are our challenges in convincing people that a carbon fee and dividend bill would be a good thing for our Central Valley?
can take that as an advocate, and we're often talking to more at the state level, though I've worked at the federal level as well, to try and get bills passed. Of course, you always have to understand the district that you're in, who is the member, what's their biography, what do they do outside of being a member of Congress, what groups are they affiliated with or they were prior to their current office. So understanding the landscape of who they are and who they listen to. I think Genevieve talked about power mapping earlier. We do that exercise too, and it's essentially you sort of put the name of the decision maker. If you need Jim Costa, for example, well, Jim Costa, cares about agriculture very much, and he's on the House Agriculture Committee. He's a leader there, and so you may think about framing your bill in the context of what will it do for farmers in the Central Valley that will probably be meaningful to him. So understanding who the members are, what their interests are, who do they listen to in their community, and then reaching out to those groups to ask them to help speak to the member would be helpful.
Okay. Hi. It's so interesting to hear each of you because the domain of citizens' climate lobby around the carbon fee and dividend is mostly around price signals, using the market as opposed to agencies and regulations, which is what all of you do. So first, I think appropriately humble and acknowledge the incredibly critical work that you all do that is not driven by price incentives, but by regulation and funding, and so it's incredibly strong infrastructure. But I do wonder if you think there is room for, and it would be valuable to put more economic incentives in place. Not exactly the carbon fee and dividend, but how can we use market dynamics to encourage good behavior as opposed to administrative regulations? For instance, some simple examples is the metering of water, charging for water at the appropriate price and how we do that. And then the other question I have, which relates particularly to fire, is I was really shocked when the Santa Rosa fire happened and it just wiped out huge communities. And they know that this is a fire zone. Fires come in this area again and again. It's cyclical. And yet the rebuilding happened immediately without putting in place a new plan to harden structures, to prevent fires, to create open space. In other words, the rush to rebuild overwhelmed the reasonable thinking about maybe we shouldn't rebuild where we were. And so how do we build political will for that? So two questions, economic incentives and political will to prevent disaster.
Good question. And I think, really, we need both. We always talk about, carrots versus sticks in policy for getting people to change their behavior. And certainly economic incentives is a way of doing that, as well as regulatory incentives, as well as taxes or fees on things such as cap and dividend. So I think it's finding the appropriate mix of tools to use, recognizing that different mechanisms are going to work better or worse in different kinds of situations. And so it can be challenging that time. What's going to work the best? People talk about what's going to be the most efficient way to do that and things like that. There's a whole lot of things to talk about. And sometimes there's, looking at how can we encourage things to build on the market side for this. So one of the things that's exciting right now is you may have heard about some of the new construction called mass timber construction, where you're building these large panels by essentially creating mega pieces of plywood or layering pieces of wood and gluing them or nailing them together in a factory and milling them to very specific sizes with computer-controlled machinery, putting them in flatbed trucks, hauling them to the job site, and basically putting them together in big pieces, and the construction goes up very fast. And so you're sequestering carbon in the wood products. You're not using carbon-intensive materials like steel and concrete, for example. And then if they're coming from sustainable forests, those trees are getting replaced by new trees that are going to grow and suck further carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's a lot of interest in developers and builders and architects in this new material. So there's kind of, I think, one interesting thing with things from kind of the demand and market size to get us desirable outcomes here. And your second question is sort of the rush to rebuild. You know, it's unfortunately that's an age-old thing, and we've seen it time and time again with flood zones. You know, there's things get flooded out, houses get destroyed, FEMA comes in, people get money to rebuild their houses in the flood zones, and it just keeps happening and happening. It's been a very challenging cycle to break. At least one benefit, the new houses that are being built have to be built to newer building codes that have been changed somewhat to deal with things like having smaller screens on the attic vents to keep those embers that get blown into the attic vents and get inside and ignite and burn the house from the inside out. That's a very common thing in wildland fires. So some of that structural hardening is now built in the new building codes, so we're going to get that. But still, you know, you're exactly right. With the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, there was a very large fire that had burned in that same area a number of decades ago. In Berkeley Hills is the same thing. There was a massive fire in the Berkeley Hills, I think it was back in the 20s maybe, and then there was the fire we had in the early 1990s. So it happens, and it's a challenge, and you know, so much of the land use development regulatory prerogatives at the local level, and the state is very careful about, very wary of how they step in there and try to tweak that. You know, we've heard some of the comments here that it's been really good to have the state come in and guide the direction, because the locals, whether it's the air board or whatever, don't want to do the right thing. So it may take more state application of pressure to move some of those things.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Forestry question for Russ. Hope you stay involved. Two questions. One is the New York Times article that said that the state controls 3%, the Forest Service controls 57%, and private sector controls 40% of forestry. That's the first question. The second question is, cap and trade is promoted as a policy to be considered around the world. 75% of the offsets go into forestry in California. Is this a good fit for countries with serious corruption and weak institutions like Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia?
Okay, so the first question, yes, in terms of the distribution of forest land ownership in California, the Forest Service is the largest owner, with over half of the forest land, and then the private ownership is the next largest, and the state ownership of forest land in California is relatively small. You have the state parks. There's about 70,000 acres of state forest land in research and demonstration forests. The State Lands Commission has a little bit of forest land that they haven't done a whole lot with for a while. But yes, it's really, you know, obviously we heard from the Trump administration or the president himself, you know, complaining about California's management of the forests. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but most of those forests are federal forests, and what are you doing about that? So, so that's very good. In terms of the cap and trade as a mechanism in forest carbon offsets, I think, you know, I mentioned the piece in my talk about the forest carbon accounting, and obviously that's a really critical piece of this in getting the accounting right. Some of that ultimately, when you're looking at offsets, gets built on modeling, because it's okay, how much carbon is this forest going to sequester over time that we're going to pay you to sequester, and you need to get that modeling right. And so I think there can, you know, very much be, and these are, you know, this is long term. You know, you're looking to at least 100-year time horizon over which these offsets are supposed to be considered and acted upon and provided. And so, you know, that's a really long time for our human institutions to have accountability for something. And particularly where you might have more corrupt or less stable or less well-funded regimes where there's some state responsibility for that accounting, I think there's plenty of opportunity for either just misfeasance or malfeasance.
So thank you very much. Our time is up. I know we could go on a lot longer with all these interesting topics, but thanks again to our panelists for joining us today.